All right, so we started with into the martyrdom of Abel a little bit in our last class period. And so let's just review a bit real quick. In chapter 1 and 2, of course, is creation. Chapter 3 is the fall of man, and God has to exercise his judgment upon the earth for the first time. He exercises his attributes of holiness and grace all at the same time. How does he show his attribute of holiness? I gave you several things I believe about that, Ben.
He demands judgments upon the man.
Okay, sure. And then those judgments were listed out. How did he exercise his grace? Dustin.
When he sought out Adam.
Okay, when he sought out Adam, he went looking for him. Anything else? Trevor?
When he promised a seed that would be the seed.
Good. When he promised the seed, there's a couple other things. He did what for them? He clothed them by making them clothing. Of course, that involved what? An animal sacrifice. So that's the first sacrifice. And there's so many details that we're not told. But I think we can kind of, not in the wrong way, but read into the story and see, of course, God taught them how to sacrifice. Of course, God taught them how to, what the process was for man to be redeemed back to God. So there's no question those things were a part of his teaching towards them. Well, Cain and Abel are born. It seems to be kind of, I think, kind of close together. You know, Adam knew Eve, his wife. She had Cain. She said, I've gotten a man from the Lord. And she again bare his brother Abel. So it seems like they were born pretty quick in succession. And, of course, Cain and Abel grow up. Cain becomes a farmer. Abel becomes a shepherd. A very noble thing to do. Of course, if you can imagine in those days, a shepherd. Now, that's kind of interesting that quick. He's a keeper of the sheep. They knew, I think God taught them these things. They knew that it was good to keep animals together and to raise sheep. And I think Abel thought that and knew that this was a noble thing to do with sheep specifically. Well, anyway, they bring their sacrifices. And we see here with Cain, I want you to see, and this is one of the things I want you to get from this book. I thought it was really interesting, his take on this. We see Cain's first attempt at religion. This is the first manly attempt to establish religion. Of course, we're saying religion apart from God. Man's attempt. So what do we see about this? First, we see here in chapter 4, I haven't turned there yet, let me get there myself. Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. Actually jump down a few pages, or a few verses a little bit further down. Let's see here. All right, verse 2. Abel was a keeper of the sheep. Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. He brings of the fruit of the ground. So we see this attempt at religion. First, it involved a purely human scheme. A purely human scheme. This is man's idea of what to bring to the Lord. Anytime we bring our ideas to God, the Bible later on, Isaiah chapter 64, calls those things filthy rags. Man's works, man's attempts are nothing to God. God's not interested in our attempts. I know there's sentimental value when my children, my real little kids, don't get me wrong, girls, you'll think I'm hard-hearted here probably, but there's sentimental value when my little kids bring me a little picture that they've colored, and of course they don't know how to color. They just got markings everywhere, and so I'll say to them, oh, very nice, Dad, this is for you. And I'll, thank you, that's very nice. I want them to get in the habit of giving me stuff, but I want them to exercise their abilities a little bit more. And so I put it away real nicely, and then when they're not looking, it goes in the file, the deep file that sits on the floor. But and then there is sentiment. I have kept a few of those, by the way, just so that later on, I'm a sentimental guy, and later on I can pull those out and say, see what you drew like when you were 2 years old, or 3 or whatever. But that's their attempts. That's what we're talking about. A manly attempt, a human attempt at pleasing God. And it's purely man-made. It's purely come up in his own mind. The notion that good works merit salvation is at the heart of every false religion on earth. Every false cult. Good works merit salvation. What makes us think that we can earn our way to heaven? But it's at the heart of every teaching, every cult, every denomination in this world. Cain's religion was founded on a human scheme. Secondly, we see also that it was founded on a purely human sacrifice. His own sacrifice. His version of what a sacrifice should be. His second error was as bad as his first error. Instead of centering around the work of Christ, it had a focus in a purely human sacrifice. It cost him something, but people have always wanted to do something in their false religion and wanted to do something that actually did cost them something. It makes them feel better. Makes them feel good. Some people give very little, have very little of a, where they're willing to spend very little. I was talking to somebody once, and they were talking about saving the elephants. And they thought, man, they told me, I really believe in this cause of saving the elephants. I have given $25 to this cause of saving elephants. I said, wow, unbelievable. If I believe in something very much like you, I might be willing to give up $25, for a cause that I really believe. That really shows my commitment to it, $25. But here in this case, he was willing to make a sacrifice, but it was his idea of a sacrifice. You see then next, verse 5, let me mention here. But unto Cain and to his offering he, God, had not respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. And the Lord said unto Cain, why art thou wroth, and why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. So we see here in verse 7, God was giving Cain another chance. Hey, Cain, that's the wrong sacrifice. And Cain, instead of doing well and bringing the right sacrifice, he continues to reject and resist. And of course, it just goes right in the next verse, verse 8. And Cain talked with Abel his brother. Well, let me mention this also about this first religion. We see that this is a purely human satisfaction. This is a purely human satisfaction. This is Cain saying, oh, this is good enough. This is just fine. If God's not happy with what I've given him, that's his problem. He was satisfied with himself. He thought he had done good enough. And of course, God specifically said, you've not done well. That's not good enough. So, Cain kills his brother Abel. This is the first murder, by the way, Genesis, remember? Beginnings. This is the first murder by the first child born into the world, into the sin-cursed world. There'd be a later man also listed in Genesis chapter 5 who also was a murderer. We'll mention him later on. So we see, let me mention a few other firsts that we see here. Chapter 5, before I get to those first, the rest of chapter 4 and then into chapter 5, we see all the patriarchs, all of these original, very early on, not original, but very early fathers. And they lived for just these unbelievable lengths of time. Towards the end of chapter 4, look at verse 16. Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch. And he builded a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. So here's the first city that's established. Well, it's interesting. God told Cain, you're going to be a wanderer on the earth. And so Cain goes and builds a city. I really think that he's purposely he's trying to go against God's direction for him. Saying, you're going to be a wanderer. He's saying, no, I'm not going to be a wanderer I'm going to build a city with lots of people in it. Yes?
I never thought about this, but looking at his sacrifice, he offered the fruit of the ground, and that was one of the things that was cursed.
You sure?
God cursed.
Yes, that's a good point too.
I think he probably knew that.
Huh. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Anybody else? Very good point. All right, let me mention some other firsts before I go through listing out some of these people. We're not going to take the time to look at every single one of these people. There's no point in that. Let me have you write down and note down some of these other firsts that are mentioned. We see in chapter 4, verse 19, the first polygamist. Chapter 4, verse 19, Lamech took unto him 2 wives, Ada and Zillah. Okay, so there's the first polygamist. We also see the first songwriter. Chapter 4, verse 23. Lamech said unto his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech. Hearken unto my speech. That word speech is probably in reference to a poem or a song, a ballad. And of course, his songs, or his speech, even if you don't agree with that, his speech is, for I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. It's a poem, no question. So he's giving a poem about killing somebody. So there's the second murder, but there's by the first polygamist. Also the first songwriter, probably. We see also the first, as far as we know, the first, how would you say this? Oh, in verse 21, the first musicians. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all such as handle the harp and the organ. The inventors of musical instruments. Jabal, chapter 4, verse 20. In verse 4 verse 21. I have my verses written down backwards. Sorry. Chapter 4, verse 20. Ada bare Jabal. He was the father of such as dwell in tents and of such as have cattle. So he would be what we would consider a nomad. So he's traveling from field to field, place to place to keep fresh grass for his animals. So he's the developer of the nomadic lifestyle. This is as old as can be. By the way, there are still people who do this, even as contrary to our day and age that is.
Was that Jubal or Jabal?
Jabal was the tent dweller and the nomad. Jubal was the musician. Okay, so all right, and then there's another first here. Verse 22. Zillah, that's his other wife. So this is a good family, you know. He has 2 wives. He's got sons through both of these 2 wives. And they're both sides of the half family are inventors and firsts. So anyway, verse 22. Zillah, she bare Tubal Cain. Cain. Oh yes. They have a surname of their grandfather, Cain. Anyway, an instructor of every art artificer in brass and iron, and the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. So this is the first inventor of metalworking, bronze and iron. Bronze and iron. That's pretty amazing. You're going to get iron out of the ground. Okay? They figured out. I say figured out. I don't know. I really think that God told Adam all of these things originally. But they knew that you get iron out of the ground, you get bronze out of the ground, you get these elements out of the ground. God put them there for us to use. Okay? Everything in this world God gave us to use. Which, by the way, man is supposed to subdue the earth. Of course, I believe that much of that is lost to the devil. The devil is now the prince of the power of the air. But man is supposed to subdue the earth. And they are doing just that. Taking the things out of the ground and using them. All right, chapter 5 then. This is the book of the generations of Adam. Let's move on down. I'm not going to go through all of these. But the main characters, you know them. There are 10 of them here in chapter 5. Adam, Seth, Enos, Canaan, Mahalaleel, Jared, Enoch. Let's see here. Methuselah, and then Lamech, and then Noah. So those are from Adam to the flood, we see these main patriarchs. Of course, most of those we don't need to know too much about. Let's mention Enoch. The Bible talks about Enoch. Excuse me. Not just here in this passage. There's very little actually to be said here in Genesis chapter 5 about Enoch. Look at verse 21. Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. And Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah. So something happened at the birth of Methuselah that caused Enoch to say, I'm going to start to walk with God. He begat Methuselah he lived after he begat Methuselah 300 years and begat sons and daughters. 365 years old, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Enoch is the first of two people here in the early part of Genesis who walked with God. Enoch and Noah. The Bible says in chapter 6 that Noah walked with God. But Enoch also walked with God. So let me mention a couple of things in other passages that we know about Enoch. Look in the book of, all the way to the other end of your Bible, book of Jude. Jude, verse 5. Did I give you the wrong passage? Jude verse 14. I'm going to use Jude verse 5 a little bit later on. Sorry. Jude verse 14. Let's go back a few verses. Go back to verse 12. These are spots in your feasts of charity when they feast with you, feeding themselves without fear. These are the wicked people of the Cainites and the followers of Balaam and the followers of Korah's doctrine. These are spots. Feeding themselves without fear. Clouds they are without water, carried about of winds, trees whose fruit withers without fruit, twice dead, plucked up by the roots. These are garbage. Okay? Raging waves of the sea, foaming out their own shame, wandering stars. There you go. You know, if you believe in all the weird things about stars. Anyway, to whom is reserved the blackness of darkness forever. Now, verse 14. And Enoch also, the seventh from Adam, prophesied of these. By the way, that history in Genesis chapter 5 is accurate history. Even Jude says Enoch was the seventh man from Adam. Go back and count them sometime. It's exactly the truth. Everybody knew that that was true. The people of, the old days, they believed that. They knew that. And here, people come along now and say, well, that's ridiculous. No, that's exactly what was the case. The seventh man prophesied. So Enoch prophesied. Did you catch that? Enoch was a prophet of God. Something happened at the birth of Methuselah. God spoke to Enoch. Isn't that what a prophet is? He's a spokesman for God. God speaks to the prophet, and the prophet speaks to the people. So Enoch was a preacher. He prophesied of these. He prophesied about these wicked people listed in verses 12 and 13. Enoch said that was going to happen. By the way, verse 13 sounds an awful lot like the flood. Raging waves of the sea foaming out their own shame. Verse 12 talks about the trees being uprooted. Enoch prophesied of these, saying, behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints. There weren't many saints in heaven yet when Enoch was preaching this. There was Abel. he was there. But he's talking about heaven. He's talking about 10,000s of his saints. Now look what's going to happen. Enoch preached this. To execute judgment upon all, and to convince all that are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds which they have ungodly committed, and of all their hard speeches which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. Wow. He liked to preach against the ungodly, folks. Ungodly. Well, he was a preacher. So what happened? He received word from God about the coming judgment. It's very obvious. To execute judgment. He's coming to he received word about the coming judgment. I'm not saying he knew exactly what was going to happen. I don't think he knew all the details, but he believed in a coming judgment. Guarantee you that. And Enoch named his son Methuselah. What does the name Methuselah mean? Something along those lines. When he dies, it shall come. I believe Enoch believed that the coming judgment, they didn't know what was going to happen as far as how many judgments there are, how long the earth was going to be around, all. But he believed that God was going to return and execute judgment upon all these ungodly people. And so Enoch was a preacher of these things. He's the first recorded prophet. He prophesied. He's the first. There's another first for you. And it's great. I think it's amazing that the book of Jude, look, all through the Bible history, nobody records what Enoch said. But they obviously had it somewhere, or then God just told it to Jude. And here's Jude at the very end. 80 AD, 90 AD. And Jude says, yeah, Enoch preached this. And nobody else says a word about it, And we have the very words that Enoch said in his prophecy. So Jude verses 14 and 15 are verses that tell us a little bit more about Enoch. Of course, there's another passage we find about Enoch. Hebrews 11. Go to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 5. By faith, Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and was not found because God had translated him. For before his translation, he had this testimony that he pleased God. But without faith, it is impossible to please him. It's directly connected to that previous verse. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. By the way, God said, I believe God told Enoch, you name your son Methuselah, and when he dies, the judgment of God will come. I don't think it's an accident that Methuselah lived longer than any person in human history. What's the point? God held off His judgment as long as He could. And He extended it longer than any other human being had ever lived. God waited, held back His judgment until He had to send it. So I think it's a very interesting thing that Methuselah, the one who is this fulfillment of this prophecy of the coming judgment of God, he didn't, or he lived for so very long. All right. Lucky Enoch, right? He's not lucky. He walked with God and God took him. He never had to go through the valley of the shadow of death. Who's the other person who didn't have to do that? Elijah. Even Jesus went through the valley of the shadow of death. So, Enoch and Elijah. I named my son with an E. No, that's not related. Enoch and Elijah. All right. That brings us to chapter 6. That's all I'm going to deal with here in chapter 5. Let's move on to chapter 6. Came to pass, verse number 1. Here we go. Came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me go back a bit. Not back, but I've got a couple other things to mention to you that I forgot to mention to you. Okay, I put it somewhere here. Okay. Let me ask a couple questions about this, and we'll answer them as much as we possibly can. First, I want to talk about what the pre-flood world was like. So here between chapter 5 and chapter 6 is a good time, I think, to discuss this. What was the pre-flood world like? There's a lot of evidence, obviously. If you're in creation science or if you study these kinds of things, you know that there's huge amounts of evidence constantly being discovered. I should have brought with me. I have a nice little rock that I found. My parents' farm. There's a creek bed, and one of the sides of the creek, at a little section of it, has a pretty good sized cliff. And so one day we were down, we would play down in the water all the time. And one day somebody started pulling rocks down off the edge of the cliff, and we just peeled them off, and there's just loads and loads of fossils. And so we were trying to, all the kinds of, not little bitty things, found butterfly looking things and all kinds, dragonfly looking things. So anyway, all kinds of sea organisms and all little things as well. And a lot of them we were able to actually peel them out of the rock and so on. And so one of the things I found about this long, I couldn't get the rest of it because it was obviously was a long run, but it looks like a bone. It's either a bone or a tree branch. It's about that wide, and it definitely, to me, looks like a bone. I've never had it professionally looked at or anything, but if you look in the end of it, you can definitely see different veins going through it. Not all the way through, you can't see, but you can definitely look into it. It's about that long, about that wide. It's in a rock. I'll have to show it to you. It's in my office sometime. I meant to bring it. I forgot today. But what was the pre-flood world like? Let me mention just a number of things. I think it's based a lot on this evidence. It was probably warm everywhere. A pleasant, mild climate. There were no deserts or ice caps. No deserts or ice caps. It was universally warm and comfortable. The earth was surrounded probably with some type of water protector, a barrier. The land surface was probably much larger, and the oceans much smaller. Of course, the earth was one. Bible very much, I believe, indicates that the earth was one. It was divided after the flood. But before the flood, it was one. That means there weren't continents. It was one continent. I always laugh when I read somewhere, that I don't remember the name of it, but there was some... Pangea. There you go. The original continent. I mean, but I just laugh because even secular people believe that the earth at one time was one continent. So,
When I was in public school, they taught us that it was, one continent and what's that called? The plates.
the tectonic plates.
They said after millions of years, they gradually spread farther apart.
Yep. So, anyway, another interesting thing about it, there probably were no tall mountains or deep canyons. The earth's topography was gentle, rolling hills at best. There were hills, right? The Bible says every hill was covered with water. There were hills. But probably not high mountains and things. There's many mountains. Even California has mountains a mile above sea level that have fossils, sea organism fossils in them. So very much used to be a flat area. Who was with me? Trevor was with me this summer, and you were as well, in an ensemble in Arizona. And one of the places we stopped at, there's a rest stop, and there was some signs there that talked about how the entire area at one time, there in the desert, this was all underwater. And they found a lot of things here in the desert that clearly showed this used to be underwater. It used to be a seabed. Things like that. Very interesting. So that fits with that idea. Another interesting thing about it is that there was vegetation everywhere. Vegetation everywhere. We know this from oil and other things that now we're finding. Of course, it's underground now, but it's everywhere. And there's examples, there's fossilized things everywhere of vegetation. And of course, the Bible says that there was no rainfall. The earth was watered by early morning dews and springs. All right. The civilization. How civilized were the people? Any ideas on that, real quick? How civilized were they? Did they live in caves? No, we've seen that already. They developed all kinds of things. They had figured out how to domesticate animals. They knew how to live in the world that they were a part of, probably more than we do today. There's examples of batteries. There's examples of electricity. There's examples of all kinds of things. I'm not saying they had smartphones or anything, but they might have had. They probably had a GPS, helped them get around. All right, now let's go to chapter 6, verse 1 at this point. Came to pass when men began to multiply in the face of the earth and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. Of course, Moses was 120 when he died. Verse 4, there were giants in the earth in those days. And also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. So, I think it's fitting to dive into this a little bit. Who are the sons of God and who are the daughters of men? There's basically two theories on this. I lean towards one of the two, but I really don't. There's a lot of evidence, I think, for either side. Let me first give you the natural way to interpret this passage. The natural way. And now, by the way, this is my way of calling this, okay? Somebody else will probably look at this and say, hey, this is not the natural way, you know, whatever. But this is what I believe is the natural way to interpret the passage. Here it is. The simple interpretation, natural interpretation, is that the sons of God were the individuals belonging to the line of Seth, while the daughters of men were the unsaved girls who belonged to the line of Cain. See, the Sethites, the follower or the family of Seth, okay, these are the sons of God. These are the spiritual ones. These were the ones who were supposed to be doing right, and they saw the daughters of men of the family of Cain, and they saw that the daughters, and they saw that these girls were beautiful, and they took them wives, and they married them, and so on. That's one of the ways of interpreting this passage. Let me mention to you some of the things I think that probably support this idea. That if you have the Sethites and the sons of God marrying the daughters of men, there's things that support this and things that are a real problem presented here. Anybody like this view? Anybody know anything about this idea or any way to support it or not support it? Okay, let me just throw it out at you then. The other view, and without getting into it, the other view says that the sons of God are angels, fallen angels, who came down to the earth and intermarried with the daughters of men. Sons of God intermarrying with the wicked women, and of course that's what produces, they say, the giants in the earth in those days. Okay, so let's note down some things that seem to support this, that definitely they use to support this idea. Genesis 1:11 says that people would have children, and animals would have baby animals, and the plants would reproduce after their kind. After their kind. So they say, well, this has to be humans marrying with humans because they had humans after its kind. In 1 Corinthians 15:38 through 40, Paul says, this is the resurrection chapter, so he's talking about earthly and heavenly and so on. And he says this, that there are celestial bodies and bodies terrestrial. Celestial meaning heavenly, terrestrial basically meaning earthly. So what Paul seems to be doing there is distinguishing between the two. There's heavenly bodies and there's earthly bodies. In other words, they don't mix. So that's a support for this theory that it couldn't have been some heavenly beings coming down to the earth. Okay, so 1 Corinthians 15:38 through 40. Also, Moses, when he wrote this, put this together, he did not use the regular Hebrew word for angel. 28 times in the Pentateuch, he uses a different word for angel than he does here in this passage. So surely they say it wasn't angels. Okay, so the Hebrew word, M-A-L-A-K, is what Moses normally used for an angel. But they say in this case he did not use that word for an angel, if that's an angel. The Bible also here in this passage says there were giants. Is it used? Yes, verse 4. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Mighty men. That term mighty men in the Old Testament never refers to angels. It never refers to anything other than human men. David had mighty men, right? He had all these mighty men. Were those mighty men angels? Oh no, they were his nephews, the sons of Zariah, and they were not very good. So the term mighty men, you could say, always refers to humans. It doesn't refer to angels. Oh, and then the other obvious passage, I didn't bring it up yet. Matthew 22:30 says this, "For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven." So, Matthew 22:30 says that angels don't marry. We refer to angels normally in the male gender, okay? But they don't have marriage relations. That's the point of Matthew 22:30. And in heaven, humans won't either. They'll be like the angels of God in heaven. So, those are some points that would be brought up to support this view that this could not have been a heavenly creature. It had to be human beings, sons of God, some sons of God, probably the Sethites, intermarrying with the Cainites. Okay, now the other view is, laugh all you want, the other view is, and I'm going to call this, let's see here. I'm going to call this the view of the Hebrew language that seems to support this view. So the other one is the natural view. This is more the language view. It's based upon the Hebrew language. Well, figure that out. So there's basic arguments for this view. Let me state the view. It says that the sons of God were wicked and fallen angels who committed immoral and unnatural physical acts with women. All right, John Phillips here, he has a lot to say about that as well. Before you laugh this view off, it wasn't until about 400 AD when the Catholic Church came up with this view. The vast majority of people have always believed, according to what we find in history and in Bible believers, the vast majority of Christians have usually believed that these were fallen angels intermarrying with the daughters of men. So, be careful how you laugh there. All right. The Hebrew phrase, sons of God, interpreted here the sons of God, always refers to angels in the Old Testament. Okay? So, that's a great point. So this is with the language. The language here. This term, the sons of God, in the Old Testament always refers to angels. I'll give you those passages real quickly. Several of them, 3 of them are found in the book of Job. Now, the book of Job is the oldest book of the Old Testament. So it definitely fits with the early time period. Let's turn to the book of Job, Job chapter 1, verse 6. Let's see, there we go. Job 1:6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. So, these sons of God have to be angelic beings. They are interpreted that way. And Satan was one of them. Not one of them. He came in with them. So it's angelic beings and Satan showing up in the middle of them. Go to chapter 2 then, also verse 1. Here it is again. Again there was a day, the second time, when the sons of God, that term sons of God in the Hebrew is the exact same word that's used in Genesis chapter 6. Both times here. The sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord. Go also now to Job 38. Much later, this is now God speaking to Job. Job 38, verse number 7. When the morning stars sang together. By the way, the stars sing. They do. The stars sing. There's, oh man, someone said that every single star, every single planet sings and has all of this glory and majesty to display. And here sits the earth, filled with the only song that comes from the earth is the song of destruction and of children begging for food. You know, here in America, that's not the case, but around the world, it's suffering, it's pain. Only singing that comes from this planet is that of suffering. But the morning stars sang, now look at the rest of the verse, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. So when God created the earth, and that's the context of the passage, Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Where were you when the morning stars sang together? Where were you when the sons of God, the angels, shouted for joy? Where were you, Job? So this is a passage calling the sons of God, these angels, angelic beings. All right. Give you another thing from the word itself, the sons of God. Here's another word that's used in verse number 4. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 6, verse 4 now. Where the Bible says here, verse 4, there were giants in the earth. The giants in the earth. This is this word giants. It's a Hebrew, or the Hebrew word that's used. It means fallen ones. Fallen ones. There were giants in the earth, fallen ones. Now, normally when the Hebrew Old Testament talks about huge people, anybody can think of a huge man in the Old Testament? Goliath. The word there that's used is not the same Hebrew word that's used here in Genesis 6:4. Goliath was a giant, but it has a different word. It means big. Okay, but not here. This word giant here does not mean big, even though they were. The word means fallen ones. Okay, now let me give you some other things that are related to this view. That aren't really just the language. There's almost always a basis for ancient legends. I'm not saying every legend is true, believe me. But, you know, and here's the argument. Where do all the legends come from that talk about the gods coming down to intermarry the beautiful women on the world? These legends are everywhere in history. Everywhere. Look at the Greek legends. They have gods coming down to intermarry the daughters of men. I mean, all the civilizations that have these gods, they have those kinds of stories. And so the thinking is that that's where it comes from, that there's an element of truth to that. Okay, in chapter 6, verse 4, look at the end of the passage. The same became, these descendants of these fallen ones, intermarried with the daughters of men, the descendants became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Men of renown, men that were of legend. Josephus brings out in his writings, he says the Septuagint, which of course is the Hebrew Old Testament translated into Greek, translates Genesis 6:2 as the angels of God. These are angels of God. So Josephus and the Septuagint points that out, that these are angels, fallen angels. The interpretation of the early church was always that these were angels who intermarried with the daughters of men. The church worshipped, early church often worshipped angels, not the godly church, I'm not talking about, but the early Catholic church, they worship angels. Look at 1 Peter chapter 3. Let's go back to towards the back. I'll go to Jude also, and we'll try to finish this up real quick before we run out of time. Go to 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 18. 1 Peter 3:18. For Christ also hath once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened by the Spirit. By which also he went and preached unto the spirits in prison, which sometime were disobedient, when once the long-suffering of God, here it is, waited, God's mercy was pushed off, continued, I should say, his long-suffering, he was pushed off, the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah while the ark was a preparing, wherein few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water. So there are spirits in prison. Go to, there's another passage. 2 Peter chapter 2. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4. For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. Here's again, angels being cast down. These angels are bound angels. They were chained. We saw that in chapter 1. Look at Jude, verse 1. Jude, verse 1. Verse 1, sorry. There's one chapter. Jude, verse 5. Jude, verse 5. Jude 5 says, I will therefore put you in remembrance, though you once knew this, how that the Lord, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed them that believe not. And the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. Even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication, going after strange flesh. They are set forth for an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. Now let me give you just what they think. This is the theory. These chained angels, a lot of people believe, they have been let free several times. They're obviously, according to Jude, they're fornicators. They're wicked, wicked angels. But they were released, the thinking is, released in Genesis chapter 6. They were released in the days of Sodom and Gomorrah. They were released, what's the other one? Moses mentions it. Sometime around the land of, when they were leaving the land of Egypt, the Exodus, probably at the time of Balaam, when they were committing fornication, and the giants in the land, possibly related to that. So anyway, that's the thinking. Okay, so there's seems to be a decent amount of evidence for this one as well. Any opinions? Yes?
I just find it interesting that whether it was sons of God that were actually just like righteous men, or whether they were angels, either way, it's obvious that Satan is trying to use them to bring darkness. Whether either way.
Sure.
So,
sure.
Whether you believe this way or that way, it's just obvious that Satan is fighting God's people anyways.
Okay.
So
Good point.
it doesn't really matter. It kind of makes me laugh with that when I've heard people like argue and get
Oh, sure.
heated about it, and I just find it funny that it doesn't really matter either way.
Sure. No, I agree with that. But at the same time, I also believe that in Genesis chapter 6, it was so wicked. I believe, I know the Bible says it was as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it come. But the passage there is not just saying as bad as it was then, it is now. I believe that's in reference to the surprise. The flood came and took them all away. That's how it's going to be in the last days. I believe it was a very much more wicked time in that day than it is now because of these beings. So, now, I lean this direction, obviously, if you can't figure that out. I lean this direction. I think it's not a shock to me at all that the fallen angels would corrupt. You say, well, they can't get married. Yeah, but they go against God and they do things that God doesn't intend for them to do. So, Trevor?
I guess if you do lean that way, then you could say that possibly they will be released again during the time of the tribulation or whatever, when it's going to be much more wicked than it even is now.
Sure. Which definitely indicates that they will be released again. So, yes?
Doesn't the Bible talk about a second fall of angels?
A second what?
A second fall of angels. Like Satan fell, and then I've heard somewhere, I don't know exactly where it is, but the Bible talks about a second fall. Would this be the second fall?
Oh, I don't know. I'd have to look that up. I don't know about that. I don't remember that. So we can look that up and bring it with us. We have a test next class period. Told you last week it's a week away, so we have a test next class period. I'll put a few pointers on Schoology. On my test, I have every sentence has a highlighted key word on my test. So give the view of the sons of God and the daughters of men. I'll have it highlighted. What is the Seth Cainite view? Whatever. That kind of thing. Every sentence has a highlighted key word. And see me if you have questions. I can put it on Schoology as well and give you some pointers for that.